In the soot-choked heart of London's East End, during the autumn of 1888, where the fog rolled heavy through crooked alleys and gas lamps flickered like dying stars, Eleanor Whitford lived a life that might as well have been a sentence in Newgate prison, her days bound to the rhythms of her husband's temper and the grinding demands of a household that belonged not to her, but to the Whitford family legacy, a textile empire that rose on the backs of sweating children and coughing women who toiled 12 hours a day in the looming brick factory her husband, Edmund, inherited from his father, a man whose portrait hung above the dining room mantel like a reminder that cruelty could be passed down as carefully as silver spoons. Eleanor had been 19 when she left her modest boarding school in Bath, chosen not for her beauty, though she possessed a striking kind of pale delicacy that drew stares, but for her ability to read, write, and comport herself with grace, qualities Edmund desired less in a partner and more in a secretary, someone who could manage his accounts, draft his correspondence, and keep his household in order without ever expecting warmth in return. And for a brief span in those early months, she had believed that perhaps affection might bloom like ivy along the soot-stained walls of their marriage. But by 1890, she had learned that Edmund's love was reserved only for profit margins, his mistresses, and the endless pursuit of power over those beneath him, herself included. He was a man who measured worth in productivity, who saw his workers as replaceable gears in a machine, and his wife as an extension of his property, useful only insofar as she maintained the appearance of domestic respectability at the Sunday luncheons, where his brothers, Arthur and Charles, and their smug wives gathered to speak of shipping contracts, coal strikes, and the scandal of women who dared ask for voting rights. And it was in this suffocating ritual of forced civility that Eleanor learned the art of silence, of nodding at cruel jokes and swallowing the bitterness that threatened to spill from her tongue. For every time she attempted even the smallest assertion, Edmund's response was swift and brutal, not always with fists, though those came often enough, but with words honed sharp as razors, slicing her into fragments of self-doubt until she no longer recognized the girl who once read poetry by candlelight. The Whitford house on Aldgate High Street was both fortress and prison, its high brick walls shielding the family's wealth from the poverty that pressed in on every side. Yet within those walls, Eleanor was poorer than the beggars outside, for they, at least, were free to wander, while she rose before dawn each day to stoke the kitchen fires, oversee the maids, and prepare meals for a table of men who barely acknowledged her presence except to mock her childlessness, for in 9 years of marriage her womb had remained as barren as her heart, and though doctors had whispered of Edmund's own vices, his drinking, his brothel visits, his penchant for laudanum, he had placed the blame squarely on her shoulders, calling her defective, a failure, a woman whose inability to produce an heir endangered the family's future. And so the laughter of his brothers rang like hammers in her skull each Sunday when they raised their glasses to wives who bore sons and daughters in abundance, while Eleanor sat silent, eyes lowered to her plate, enduring the spectacle of her humiliation with the composure of a martyr awaiting execution. Until one autumn evening, when the fog lay especially thick over Whitechapel, and the papers were filled with lurid accounts of another girl carved up in the alleys, Eleanor finally understood, with a clarity that chilled her blood. She was not merely unwanted, she was disposable, a liability to be rid of when Edmund's patience waned, and as she stood in the scullery scrubbing blood from the bones of a Sunday roast, she realized that if her life was to mean anything at all, it would not be in obedience, but in rebellion, not in bearing children for a man who despised her, but in crafting a legacy that would stain the Whitford name as deeply as soot stained the London sky. And the first flicker of that thought, terrible, intoxicating, lit within her chest like a match dropped in a cellar filled with coal dust. Beneath the ever-thickening smog of Whitechapel, where the air reeked of coal smoke and horse dung, and the cries of costermongers clashed with the rattle of factory carts, Eleanor Whitford moved through her days like a ghost haunting her own home, each step measured, each gesture rehearsed, every glance calibrated to avoid Edmund's suspicion, for her husband's moods had grown increasingly volatile since the downturn in the textile trade, his temper flaring at the smallest misstep, the misplacement of a ledger, the overcooking of a joint of beef, the silence that stretched too long when he demanded an answer. And though Eleanor had learned to anticipate these eruptions, she could not always avoid them, her body bearing the bruises of his hands as though she were no more than another piece of machinery gone faulty, to be struck until it yielded the desired result. And yet within that suffering, a curious resolve had begun to form, as steady and cold as the Thames itself, an understanding that if the world offered her no recourse, no protection from the tyranny of her husband and his clan, then she must craft her own deliverance. And so she began to observe with new eyes the routines of the household, the habits of the Whitford brothers who came each week for supper, the small details that no one noticed but her, how Arthur favored heavy drinking that dulled his perception, how Charles never looked at his plate but shoveled food with the distracted haste of a man always thinking of profits, how their wives prattled about fashion while ignoring the misery etched into Eleanor's face, how Edmund always insisted on being served first, his plate piled high before anyone else was permitted to eat, as though his hunger mattered more than theirs. And it was in these rituals of consumption that Eleanor saw the outline of her revenge, for meals had become the axis of the Whitford household, the one place where family gathered, where power was asserted and hierarchies reinforced. And if those meals could be corrupted, tainted at their very core, then the Whitfords' empire of pride would rot from within. In preparation, she studied the kitchens with a meticulous eye, noticing how easy it was to disguise flavors with rich gravies, how certain cuts of meat were indistinguishable once stewed with onions and cloves, how the servants rarely questioned what she carried from the market, assuming their mistress knew best. And she began to imagine, with a mix of horror and exhilaration, the possibility that the very instruments of her oppression, the knives, the cauldrons, the spice jars, might yet become the tools of her liberation, though she told no one, not even the maid with whom she shared rare moments of kindness, for to reveal even a fragment of her intent would risk everything. Meanwhile, the Whitfords themselves grew more complacent, more cruel in their certainty that Eleanor was broken beyond repair, a barren wife too timid to raise her voice, and Edmund, emboldened by their mockery, grew careless in his abuse, striking her in front of his brothers one October evening when she hesitated too long in answering a question about the accounts, and the laughter that followed, that hideous, guttural chorus of men finding amusement in her humiliation, lodged in Eleanor's chest like a splinter too deep to dislodge, festering until it infected every thought, every breath, until at last, late one night, while scrubbing blood from the flagstones where Edmund had slaughtered a pig brought in from the yard, she pressed her palm flat to the damp stone and whispered to the darkness that she would not endure another year, another month, another week. And in that whisper she felt the first pulse of power she had ever known, a thrill so sharp it made her tremble, for she understood now that freedom would not be given, it would be taken, and the taking of it would demand a price so monstrous that the Whitfords, those titans of the East End, would choke on it for the rest of their days. Thus Eleanor began to plan, not in haste, but with the patient cunning of a woman who had been denied every other weapon, timing her steps to the ticking of the great clock on the dining-room wall, rehearsing her words before the cracked mirror in her chamber, sharpening her resolve as carefully as she honed the kitchen blades. And though fear still gnawed at her, fear of discovery, fear of failure, fear of what her own hands might do. Beneath it ran a deeper current, a river of cold determination that would carry her inexorably toward a night when the balance of power in the Whitford household would shift forever. The nights in Whitechapel were restless that November, filled with the echo of boots on cobblestones, the distant shouts of drunken men staggering from taverns, and the faint tolling of church bells muffled by fog so thick it seemed to seep into the lungs of every passer-by. Yet within the tall brick house of the Whitfords, the air was heavier still, thick not with fog, but with tension. For Edmund's failures in business had grown impossible to conceal, his ledgers bleeding red ink from contracts gone sour, and machinery falling into disrepair. And though he roared at his clerks and cursed his workers for laziness, the truth was plain to Eleanor as she quietly tallied accounts at his desk by lamplight. The empire was crumbling, its foundations weakened by Edmund's arrogance and the merciless tides of industry, and with each passing day his violence worsened, not because of her mistakes, but because she was the only outlet for his fury, the only body in reach upon which he could vent his rage. And so it was that on the second Sunday of Advent, after a particularly brutal beating that left her ribs aching and her lips split, Eleanor stood alone in the kitchen and felt something inside her break. Not her bones, though they ached, but a part of her soul that had once believed escape lay in endurance, that if she bore enough she might survive untouched. Yet now she understood survival was not enough. Survival was merely prolonging misery, and so she began to act. Subtly, at first, gathering small quantities of arsenic under the pretense of needing it to rid the house of rats, pocketing scraps of meat from the market, and experimenting in secret with gravies and stews, learning exactly how much spice was needed to disguise bitterness, how long flesh must simmer before it softened into indistinguishable fibers. And though she trembled at the thought of her own audacity, she felt at last like a woman shaping her destiny rather than being crushed beneath it. Meanwhile, the Whitfords remained blind, their arrogance so great they could not imagine the pale, silent wife at the edge of the table was anything but broken. And when Arthur joked one evening that Edmund ought to trade her for a broodmare if he wanted heirs, the laughter that followed seemed to Eleanor less like mockery than a prophecy. For indeed she would become a creature of a different breed entirely, one born not to serve, but to destroy. As Advent gave way to Christmas, the house filled with festivities, the Whitford wives draping garlands of holly in the parlors, while the brothers toasted to profits that no longer existed, and Edmund demanded Eleanor host a grand dinner to prove to their associates that the family still thrived. And it was then she recognized the moment she had been waiting for, the stage upon which she could perform an act of such calculated horror that the Whitford name would collapse not from debt alone, but from disgrace eternal. And so she prepared with a calm that frightened even her, instructing the servants to take their leave early, sending the maids to their families with the pretense of generosity, until she alone remained in the great kitchen with its black iron stoves and gleaming knives, alone with her thoughts and the plan that had crystallized into inevitability. She rehearsed every detail. Edmund would drink himself into stupor, as he always did after such dinners. The brothers would grow loud and careless, the wives distracted with gossip. And in that chaos, Eleanor would seize the chance to act, her hands steady, her mind clear, for she had come to see that she was no longer simply Eleanor Whitford, the barren wife, but Eleanor the executioner, Eleanor the avenger. And when she whispered her own name into the darkness of the kitchen, testing how it sounded in the air, she almost did not recognize the voice that answered back, low and certain, the voice of a woman who had nothing left to lose. And as the bells of St. Mary's tolled midnight, their sound drifting through the fog, Eleanor sat at the wooden table with a carving knife before her, the lamplight glinting upon its edge, and she understood that by the time those bells rang again in 7 nights' time, the Whitfords would have dined on a feast they would never forget, and London itself would one day whisper her name with the same tremor it reserved for the Ripper who haunted its streets, though her work would not be that of a butcher in alleys, but of a wife in a dining hall, serving her vengeance beneath silver platters and crystal goblets, smiling all the while as her family consumed the very thing they most despised, her power. The week that followed was a theater of deception. Every gesture Eleanor made rehearsed with precision, every glance measured so carefully that no one, not even Edmund with his suspicious eyes and quick fists, could have suspected the storm gathering beneath her calm exterior. And as the house bustled with preparations for the Christmas dinner that was to impress investors, business partners, and of course the Whitford brothers and their wives, Eleanor moved like a conductor guiding an unseen symphony, directing the servants with soft-spoken authority, selecting wines from the cellar, ordering flowers from Covent Garden, and ensuring the menu would be praised as the finest the family had ever hosted. Yet within those choices lay her true composition, for she had decided that Edmund himself would provide the centerpiece of the feast, a final irony so sharp it thrilled her even as it terrified her. And so on the eve of the dinner she waited until the house slept, crept into Edmund's study where he slumped drunk over ledgers and half-empty brandy glasses, his snores rattling like some grotesque machinery, and with a steadiness she could scarcely believe belonged to her own hands, she pressed the blade of the carving knife against his throat and ended 9 years of torment in a silence broken only by the hiss of the fire in the grate. She stood over him for a long moment, not shaking, not weeping, only breathing with a clarity she had not known since girlhood, then set to work as methodically as she had done every Sunday meal, dragging his body to the kitchen, cleaning as she went, her mind a clockwork engine of focus, for she knew hesitation meant discovery, and discovery meant the gallows, and yet fear seemed distant now, as though she had stepped outside herself into the skin of someone destined to perform this act. Through the long hours before dawn she labored, cutting, cleaning, boiling, seasoning, her domestic skills twisted into instruments of horror, until the flesh that had once struck her and sneered at her lay transformed into roasts and stews that would pass any inspection, their flavors masked by cloves, onions, and rich gravies, their textures indistinguishable from the lamb and beef she had ordered days before. And as the first light of Christmas morning seeped through the sooty windows, Eleanor looked upon the feast she had prepared and felt a grim satisfaction settle over her like a mantle. For she knew the Whitfords would eat, and they would praise her, and in their very praise they would condemn themselves. That evening the house glowed with candles, garlands of holly draped across mantels, and the great dining-room table groaned under the weight of dishes Eleanor carried in with the serene grace of a dutiful wife. And no one saw the trembling of her hands, for she had trained them not to tremble. No one noticed the flicker of her eyes as Edmund's chair sat conspicuously empty, explained away with the lie that he had traveled to Manchester on urgent business, a lie so plausible that Arthur nodded with satisfaction, and Charles laughed that at least they would be spared Edmund's sour temper for the night. And so they ate, forkful after forkful, spoonful after spoonful, their mouths full of the very man whose name they bore, praising Eleanor's skill with words that cut them deeper than any blade could. "Exquisite," said Arthur. "The finest roast I've tasted in years," said Charles. "Such tenderness, my dear, how on earth did you manage it?" asked Rebecca with envy in her eyes. And Eleanor smiled with a calm so terrifying she thought she might shatter from the force of containing it, answering only, "Patience. That is the secret." And the room erupted in laughter at what they assumed was a harmless jest. Yet with each mouthful their fate was sealed more tightly, each swallow another stitch in the shroud Eleanor was weaving around them. For when the final dish was cleared and the final toast raised to the prosperity of the Whitford name, Eleanor knew that what they had consumed was not merely flesh, but the corruption of their pride, the desecration of their power. And though they laughed and drank deep into the night, oblivious, she alone understood that the empire of Whitford had ended at that very table, buried beneath silver platters and drowned in claret, its ruin complete, not by market forces or debts, but by the quiet vengeance of a woman they had dismissed as worthless, who now sat among them, silent and smiling, already planning her escape into a world that would one day whisper her story with dread. The days that followed the Whitford Christmas banquet unfurled with an eerie normalcy that only heightened Eleanor's sense of unreality. For the house bustled, as always, with servants polishing silver and wives gossiping in drawing rooms, while Arthur and Charles argued about contracts and shipping costs. Yet beneath that surface hum of industry and propriety lay a horror none of them yet understood, a horror Eleanor carried alone in the quiet chambers of her mind, though each time she walked past the dining table, she felt as though the walls themselves whispered what had been done there. The polished oak saturated with a secret that would one day erupt like rot beneath a painted surface. And still the brothers, bloated with gluttony, spoke of how tender the roast had been, how rich the stew, how Eleanor had at last proven her worth as a proper wife by managing such a feast without Edmund's direction, never realizing they praised not her skill, but their own desecration. In those days, Eleanor became both spectre and sentinel, moving silently through the halls while listening for any sign that suspicion had sprouted. But suspicion never came, only complacency. For the Whitfords were men accustomed to taking without question, certain of their dominance, blind to the possibility that the quiet woman who served them could wield a weapon sharper than their ledgers and pistols. And so Eleanor prepared her next step, escape. For she knew the charade could not hold forever, that Edmund's absence would soon require explanations no lie could sustain, and when the mask of business trips and urgent ventures cracked, the truth would claw its way from cellar to sunlight. And so she began to move supplies quietly, a few coins here, a loaf of bread there, a flask tucked beneath her skirts, while also drafting by candlelight the letter that would one day be found, a letter written in her precise, steady hand, describing in calm detail what she had done, how she had taken Edmund's life and transformed his tyranny into sustenance for the very mouths that mocked her, a letter designed not merely to confess, but to wound, to fester in their minds forever like a splinter they could never remove. And as she wrote the words, she found herself smiling for the first time in years, not with joy, but with the satisfaction of a woman who had seized her own fate. Yet as January crept in, with snow crusting the gutters and icicles dangling like daggers from the eaves, a chill of dread threaded through her triumph, for she knew the longer she remained, the greater the risk. And one evening, as she overheard Charles suggest sending a clerk to Manchester to confirm Edmund's negotiations, Eleanor's heart seized in her chest, knowing the lie was unraveling faster than she had planned. And so she resolved that her departure must come sooner, under cover of darkness, with only the horse she had bribed a stable-boy to keep ready in a rented yard on the edge of Whitechapel. And though the thought of the gallows loomed over her like a spectre, it was not the rope that frightened her most, but the possibility of failing to vanish, of being dragged back to the Whitford house as a prisoner in the very place where she had once been its prisoner wife. So she tightened her resolve as the clock struck midnight, and she laid the finished letter upon the mantel of the great dining room, propped against the brandy decanter where she knew the brothers would find it, and as she blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness, she whispered to the silence, "Let them feast upon truth now as they feasted upon flesh," before slipping into the icy streets, her cloak wrapped tight, her footsteps muffled by snow, her figure swallowed by the fog that rolled in from the Thames like a shroud. And though the city around her slept, Eleanor knew that by dawn the Whitford family would awaken to the taste of horror, and her name would be etched into their souls forever. When dawn broke over London with a pallid light that turned the snow in the gutters to grey slush and set the factory chimneys spewing their daily smoke into a sky already choked with soot, the Whitford household stirred as though nothing in the world had changed, yet everything had, for on the dining-room mantel lay the letter Eleanor had left behind, its neat script addressed simply to the Whitford family. And it was Arthur who found it first, reaching for brandy to cure his morning headache, only to pause at the sight of his sister-in-law's careful hand, and as he slit the envelope with a fingernail and began to read aloud, his voice faltered, his face drained of blood, until Charles snatched the pages from his trembling grasp and continued in a voice that grew hoarse with each line, describing in chilling detail how Edmund had not gone to Manchester at all, how he had not left the city on urgent business, how instead he had been cut down in his own study by the wife they had mocked and dismissed, and how they had consumed him, bite by bite, praising the tenderness of his flesh, mistaking his very body for a feast. And though the words were written without flourish, calm and precise, their impact struck like a hammer, each sentence driving the horror deeper, until Rebecca collapsed into a chair, sobbing, while Catherine staggered to the sideboard to vomit the remnants of her brother-in-law from her stomach, and Arthur, unable to deny what his own tongue remembered, retched into the hearth, his body convulsing with the truth of it. In the hours that followed, chaos reigned, servants dismissed in confusion, children ushered from rooms without explanation, while the brothers raged and wailed, searching the house as though Eleanor might still be hiding within its walls. But of course she was gone, vanished into the labyrinth of London's alleys, and though they scoured the cellars, what they found there confirmed every word of her confession: bones wrapped in cloth like butchered cuts of pork, scraps of flesh salted as though meant for storage, a horror so tangible they could no longer pretend the letter was madness. And from that moment the Whitford name was no longer synonymous with wealth or power, but with disgrace and whispered revulsion. For though they tried to suppress the truth, bribing constables and burning evidence, rumors spread through Whitechapel like plague, whispered in gin shops and markets, that the great Whitfords had devoured their own kin, and no matter how fiercely they denied it, the story clung to them, seeping into their dealings until investors withdrew, workers deserted, and creditors closed in, leaving the empire in ruins. As for Eleanor, she was never seen again in Aldgate High Street, though stories surfaced in scattered corners of the city, of a pale woman working as a governess in Bloomsbury, of a widow running a modest boarding-house near the docks, of a traveler spotted in Calais boarding a packet ship bound for Paris, but none could be proven, and the police, pressed by the Whitfords to capture her, eventually let the matter rot. For in a city where girls were butchered nightly in alleys, and bodies surfaced in the Thames with stones tied to their ankles, one missing wife seemed hardly worth pursuit. Yet among those who whispered her name, there was always a tremor, a sense that she had not vanished, but merely transformed, that somewhere beyond the fog, Eleanor Whitford lived free, her vengeance complete, her story a warning written not in ink, but in bone and blood, that even the most silent, disregarded woman might rise against the men who deemed her worthless, and in rising, destroy them more thoroughly than any rival or market crash could. For the Whitfords had not merely lost their fortune, they had ingested their own shame, carried it in their bellies, tasted it on their tongues, and would carry the memory to their graves, while Eleanor, riding into obscurity beneath the grey sky, finally breathed air untainted by cruelty. A fugitive, perhaps, a murderer, certainly, but above all, a woman who had seized the one thing she had been denied for 9 long years. Freedom.